Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Ron Pelot, Professor of Industrial Engineering at Dalhousie University and Associate Scientific Director of the MEOPAR Network of Centers of Excellence. Tonight's event is a panel discussion on coastal risk governance, lessons from COVID-19. As we begin this evening's panel, I would like to formally acknowledge that we are here today on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Please note that this event is being recorded and shared on the MacEachen Institute's YouTube channel. Also, there will be a question and answer period at the end, but feel free to enter any questions as we go along. I would like to thank the MacEachen Institute, the host of today's event, and in particular the excellent work of its scholarly director, Kevin Quigley, and staff members Jocelyn Rankin and Alex Brooke in organizing this panel. MEOPAR is co-hosting today's event. MEOPAR is a national network of centers of excellence, and our acronym stands for Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response. This network was formed to develop a coordinated Canadian approach to research addressing ocean and coastal issues, particularly in the face of unprecedented changes to ocean conditions and ocean uses. Since our inception in 2012, we have supported over 150 projects spanning 30 universities, involving more than 200 investigators, 800 grad students, and 200 partners, both government and industry. MEOPAR has partnered with the MacEachen Institute on several events addressing issues such as coastal resilience, critical infrastructure, port development, and climate change. Today's topic is very much in that vein. If both COVID-19 and climate change are to be treated as emergencies, the response by our leadership should have many of the same characteristics, including a clear, adaptable, and coordinated approach. Our speakers today will discuss viable policy options for the climate during and following the challenges brought about by COVID-19, with a particular focus on coastal risk governance. Starting things off, I would like to introduce our first panelist. Nancy Anningson is the Coastal Adaptation Senior Coordinator at the Ecology Action Centre. Nancy has a biology degree from Acadia University and has been working in the non-profit sector in Nova Scotia for 20 years. Nancy works with coastal community members, organizations, and provincial and municipal government to strengthen coastal protection policy, support coastal climate change adaptation efforts, and bring issues to light. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Ron. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to join this interesting panel discussion. As Ron mentioned, I work for the Ecology Action Centre, an environmental charity based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. My work at the Ecology Action Centre on the coastal team is very focused on coastal protection policy and on improving Nova Scotia's adaptive capacity in relation to coastal climate change. I thought it would be useful to start the panel by giving a snapshot of coastal climate change here in Canada's ocean playground. Nova Scotia has 13,300 kilometers of coastline. We are a province of just under 1 million people, and 70% of our population live along the coast. So we're a very coastal centered province. We have some of the highest tides in the world along the Bay of Fundy. We share that with New Brunswick. Nova Scotia sits on the path of post-tropical storms and hurricanes that are coming up the eastern seaboard. And they can be quite significant in recent history. Last year on September 7th, 2019, Hurricane Dorian hit Nova Scotia and caused just a little over $62 million in damage. During fall and winter, some of the most calls I get relate to nor'easters, those ferocious storms that we get in the fall and winter, which also cause a great deal of damage along our coast. And Nova Scotia has a particularly pressing problem when it comes to coastal climate change, and that is sea level rise. When you look at the sea level rise predictions for our country, Nova Scotia has the most severe predictions. This is in part due to vertical land movement. So in addition to the sea level rising, we are actually subsiding or sinking down a little bit. And it's a small amount, but those two factors combined have put us firmly in the red zone when it comes to sea level rise. So what we're seeing in Nova Scotia on a regular basis, there are all kinds of things happening with coastal climate change, but some of the things I get the most calls about are accelerated coastal erosion, sometimes quite significant, especially in relation to those extreme weather events. We're seeing more extreme weather events, and we're seeing those events more frequently. We're seeing a lot more coastal flooding. We're seeing storm surge, inundation caused by sea level rise, and even saltwater intrusion of fresh groundwater. So, this is happening on a regular basis. It's no longer a once in a while thing that's happening. It's happening on a very regular basis. And when Nova Scotia's coastal ecosystems are vibrant and healthy, they're actually helping to buffer coastal climate change. But unfortunately, with human interference, and our coastline is becoming quite well developed, that's negatively impacting the resilience of those ecosystems, and they aren't able to buffer and protect us from those coastal climate change impacts. For example, when we destroy a dune system to repave a road or to put in a wharf, when we install a concrete seawall along the shore, when we cut down all the vegetation along a coastal site, or when we infill a salt marsh for coastal development. Each time we do something like that, we are severely damaging our coastline's impact and our natural ability to adapt. And with respect to sea level rise, unfortunately, even when we are successful in mitigating climate change and taking care of what's happening, which many of us are working hard towards, unfortunately, the sea level is going to continue to rise for an extended period of time, and this change is irreversible. We will not be going back. The sea level is, that's something that's going to be happening. So when you consider all of those things, as cumulative factors, it's a pretty grim picture, and it is an urgent situation. Simply put, Nova Scotia is not in a position to ignore coastal climate change. Now, on the plus side, or some positive news to hopefully counterbalance that grim forecast, Nova Scotia has taken an innovative policy step in the right direction with the creation of the Coastal Protection Act. So that act went in April of 2019, and currently the regulations are being developed for that act. And what that piece of legislation does is it sets a minimum setback and a minimum vertical allowance for where we can build along our coast. So hopefully we will not be putting structures in dangerous places as we move forward. We'll be building safely sited back from the ocean and elevated from high water mark. And that is really good news when the act goes into force, which I hope will be in the spring of 2021. As I say, those regulations are being developed now. So if the act is effective and if it is enforced well, that is good news for future developments along the coast. The trouble is, what do we do about all the structures that sit along our coast right now? So we desperately need in Nova Scotia a coastal adaptation plan that helps us to assess risk and prioritize most particularly dire affected areas. We need to put in place all kinds of policy, and we can do it at all sorts of different levels, municipal and provincial, and things that will ensure positive actions along our coast, restorative actions, changing the way we build roads and infrastructure along the coast to help us manage climate change better, further protection of our ecosystems from toxins, from polluting industries. There are all sorts of things we can do there to improve the situation. We also need to make information available and do a lot more building of understanding within our coastal communities and with our municipal decision makers so that they have a full understanding of what coastal adaptation options look like, which ones are more effective, which ones work well together, which will work along their particular coastline. We have a very diverse coastline in Nova Scotia, and we need to look at the disadvantages of hard armoring and the impacts, and then we need to coordinate our efforts so that we can access the resources and share this information. Right now, all of those municipalities are struggling with the same issues, even if their coastline is slightly different, and we need to get a baseline of understanding and then a coordinated approach to accessing the funds that will help us develop and adapt. When I was preparing tonight and thinking about COVID and global health crisis in comparison to a climate change crisis, and particularly the coastal aspects of the climate change crisis, at first I scratched my head a little bit, but then a couple of things became very clear to me. And so I would say one of the most pressing points that comes to my mind when you compare those two catastrophes or those two crises is that it is far better to expend our resources and put our focus in preparing in advance of a catastrophe than it is to try and deal or respond or mitigate a disaster. So when it comes to coastal climate change, the adaptation costs for preparing versus the repair costs can be quite significant. I think the Insurance Bureau of Canada estimates that every $1 spent preparing mitigates $6 in disaster relief funds. So that was one of the points that came to my mind. Another point that came to my mind, and this is a frustrating one for policy folks and enforcers everywhere, I suppose, no matter how good the intentions behind policy and regulations, there are always going to be people who will defy or resist the rules, deny the science, and bristle at government intervention. So we see this in COVID with people having outbursts and upset about wearing masks, unwilling to social distance, unwilling to limit their group sizes. In coastal climate change, we see this all the time. People are always saying, you know, surely people know by now not to be building or buying in dangerous places, but they aren't. They continue to put themselves at risk and put our coastal ecosystems at risk. And that's a really big challenge that continues despite the looming crisis. And then the last thing I would say is one of the important lessons and the similarities between those two crises is that collaboration and sharing is incredibly important. We've seen even in the 9 months that we've been dealing with COVID, significant improvement in how we're treating cases. I think a reduction in the overall death rate because people are sharing across the globe. We've done this and this works in this scenario and so on. And same with the preventative measures. We've shared what's been working, what's not working. We have a much better understanding of what we're dealing with. The same with coastal climate change. Here in Nova Scotia, all of our coastal municipalities are struggling with the same issues. And if we aren't coordinating a way of them sharing lessons learned, best practices, sharing the resources and the expertise, and ideally coordinating and sharing resources to respond, we will not be able to move ahead and improve our adaptive capacity. So those would be the main things that come to my mind. And I think that is my time. So thank you, and I will turn it back to you, Ron.
Excuse me, Ron, you're muted, please.
Yes, thank you, Nancy. That was very interesting and a great introduction. Our next panelist, Jason Thistlethwaite, is an associate professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo, and associate director for Partners for Action. His research evaluates climate change risk management strategies designed to reduce economic vulnerability. Jason has published widely on issues including private environmental governance, the role of insurance in climate change adaptation, and policy tools for urban flood risk management. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks for that introduction, Nancy. I'm actually going to build and echo some of the points that, some of the strong points she was making. When the pandemic started, and you started to see some of the government's response, it sort of gave me that Groundhog Day feeling. And it was like, here we go again. You know, we're going to see a lot of the same barriers and challenges that Canadian governments put in front of themselves, to be honest, when it comes to disaster risk reduction or coastal risk reduction, as we do with COVID. So I really do think that COVID has revealed some of the significant gaps in Canada's capacity to govern risk. And it's not a surprise for researchers or practitioners working on how to improve Canada's preparedness to coastal risks and climate change. And as Nancy mentioned, critically, governments have failed to invest and develop public policy that proactively responds to risk before it materializes and disrupts our daily lives. Reducing risk before a hazard emerges, like COVID-19 or climate change, is really a core principle of risk management. And at the University of Waterloo, our research team there is really interested in how we coordinate public policy to support risk management. And for the sake of the discussion today, what I'm talking about is a specific form of risk management known as anticipatory risk management, which is more or less, being proactive. And a core part of anticipatory risk management is the precautionary principle. Actions are taken early and without regret, despite uncertainty in the science. This is the same approach climate change scientists have been promoting for decades. Yes, we can't pinpoint locations where flooding or wildfires are likely to cause harm, but this is no justification for sitting on our hands and waiting for this to happen. And in Canada, this is something that we really struggle with. And this might be surprising in the case of COVID, especially since a lot of public opinion polls are largely supportive of government efforts. My concern and my suspicion around that is that support is fleeting and is largely a response to messaging out of government that they're using to actually reduce expectations on themselves and instead put burden on individuals to pick up the slack and do most of the hard work. You hear this all the time. It's on you and your family to reduce your social contacts. But missing, of course, is a recognition that it's governments that have the capacity, resources, and expertise to do most of the heavy lifting around pandemic management. And indeed, the best pandemic responses have come from countries such as South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam that recognize that individual actions amount to very little without robust government response and resources. These countries have invested heavily in strategic testing aimed at reducing clusters, aggressive restrictions for high-risk areas, and rigorous public education campaigns promoting government public health resources needed to manage risk. So in my time today, I wanted to talk a little bit about why Canada is a little different and why is it that we struggle with some of these aspects of risk management. And I'm going to, and there are a few reasons I have that we often talk about and we've seen the research, but I want to focus on one in particular today. And it regards governance, and in particular, how gaps in coordination between Canada's governments often lead to suboptimal outcomes. And I want to give you just a couple examples in the time I have. So the first is that we have an intergovernmental coordination problem in Canada. We have policy that is adopted at different levels that often works at cross purposes. So you heard Nancy mention before the Coastal Protection Act and how it's designed as an anticipatory risk management tool to pull, ensure that property is not built in high risk areas along the coastline. That is a very sound and very, evidence-based suggestion. But what we see there is that the provincial is making rules and policies that actually conflict with a lot of the interests and resources of municipalities that in fact support this development. Municipalities in Canada are dependent on property taxes as their main source of revenue. So you can see that we are asking municipalities to develop local rules that align with provincial ones, and this can easily work at cross purposes. And indeed, in Canada, across the country, we see continuing development in high-risk areas, mainly because they have such a static value. You want to live on the water, and so they're going to get a big, municipalities are going to earn a lot there on the property taxes associated with them. In the context of COVID, our risk communication has largely been a mess thanks to poor intergovernmental coordination. Mandatory mask rules are, of course, an excellent example of such policy misalignment. Early in the pandemic, federal and provincial guidance did not require the use of masks, with the exception, of course, of New Brunswick, who was first off the bat suggesting that we should move towards mandatory masks. And what ended up happening is that local public health units who were on the front lines of the pandemic recognized that we got to throw everything we have at this. We're struggling to contain this because we don't have the resources locally to be able to manage it. And so mandatory masking in Canada was very much a bottom-up, public-led movement. I mean, even where I'm sitting in Ontario, the province recently said that, okay, we are now going to make mask mandatory. This is, of course, after the first wave and entering our second. And 97% of the province has already got mandatory mask rules in place. So you can see that this led to significant confusion in the early period of the pandemic and really led to far more cases and deaths than are necessary. The second example that I quickly like to talk about is the issue of resources. And in Canada, we have a problem where the actor that is generally most responsible for risk management, those being municipalities, actually are the most vulnerable, but also have the least resources to be able to manage it. And really what we need to have happen here are the upper tier governments with larger tax bases invest more of those resources into local governments to be able to support this type of recovery. You know, really where most of the funding goes in Canada, and Nancy mentioned this as well, is that we spend very little on anticipatory measures and much more on reactive measures. We're very good at rebuilding in the aftermath of a disaster, often in high-risk areas, mind you, but we do very little to protect ourselves from the next type of disaster. My favorite report on this is in 2016, the Auditor General at the federal level took a look at Canada's disaster programs. Many that we actually have been designed with the intent of investing in anticipatory risk management. And the report found that there was very little evidence that money was getting out the door in any way to support anticipatory risk management, and to this day it is you know, from a budget perspective, pretty much peanuts compared to what we spend on disaster recovery and assistance. And there's of course evidence in the pandemic response that we haven't effectively prioritized our resources towards anticipatory risk management. We lack sufficient PPE. We continue to underfund testing and fund actions early on to manage outbreaks. You know, for example, we know that socioeconomic vulnerability is not only a major determinant of disaster risk, but it's also a major determinant of COVID risk. And yet we fund testing sites that are far outside the capacity of people in those situations to be able to get them. How can we remedy these gaps? I'm going to quickly go through these and then turn it over back to Ron. And these really come from, you know, we're working on this research now, and these are more just our thoughts, high level thoughts on what we can do, and we're looking at how we can test them and criticize them. But in Canada, the federal government needs to play a much more active role in emergency response. Compared to other industrialized jurisdictions, the US, UK, Germany, and Australia, the federal role is small, ad hoc, and almost always reactive. And this is distinctive from a lot of our GA counterparts. I think we need to quit treating Canadians like toddlers and disclose and make transparent risk information of all kinds. You know, tell us if our house is located in a coastal risk zone, identify locations with COVID outbreaks. We can handle it, and Canadians deserve this type of information if there's an expectation by governments that we are to be risk managers, which is a significant burden to put on any individual. And lastly, we need to prioritize resources to reduce socioeconomic vulnerability in our communities. As I mentioned before, early patterns of COVID disproportionately attack those who are marginalized and low income. And the same is true with environmental hazards like wildfires and extreme weather. Layering on support for these types of communities would go a long way to reducing the overall costs of recovery and bringing back the economy, as many people who are marginalized have to take time off work or quit their job, and those ramifications last a lot longer than simply fixes for physical infrastructure or building back property. Okay, thank you so much for having me today, and I look forward to the rest of the presenters. Over to you, Ron.
Thanks, Jason. A lot of food for thought there, a lot of interesting points you brought up. Our next panelist is Melina Kourantidou. Melina is an environmental and resource economist and a junior fellow of the MacEachen Institute. She holds a PhD from the University of Southern Denmark and joined the Marine Affairs program at Dalhousie University as a postdoctoral fellow in 2019. And in 2020, the Marine Policy Center at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Her work is grounded in natural resource management and governance issues. Her research integrates natural and social sciences research and focuses specifically on analyzing effects of ecological and socioeconomic changes in coastal communities. Go ahead, Melina.
Thank you very much, Ron, for the introduction, and thank you for having me on this panel. Alex, if I could have my slides, please.
Yep, they're up.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that I'm doubtful on whether it's fair to use the term emergency to characterize climate change, if only because of the timescale involved. So the timescale considered for COVID-19 is days, weeks, months, while for climate change it is slower, but it requires urgent action now. And so the idea is that we want to be able to anticipate, absorb, and diffuse change, whether this is sudden or prolonged. But let's try to conceptualize the key elements of those two in terms of the time horizon involved. So when we think about the long term, we need to think about preparedness, and we need to plan for a future that our generation will not experience. While at the same time keeping in mind that today's mitigation efforts affect both our generation and the future generation. At the same time, we need to take responsibility for where and how coastal development takes place, and there's tools for that, such as land use planning. Last, we need to be in a position for managed retreat if that becomes necessary. While in the short term, we need to be prepared for making plans and taking actions that reduce risk and increase resilience. And these may be, for example, grey and green coastal protection, preservation of coastal wetlands and mangroves that provide natural defenses, improvements in social capital, disaster training and education, enforcement of building codes, diversification of our economies, just to name a few of those. At the same time, though, we need to be able to evaluate the hazards and have the communities themselves choose the losses that they are willing to accept, and work through those policies to ensure that the development happens according to the plans. Now, we're all familiar with sea level rise, which is happening at a rapid pace. Risks and disasters in the coastal zone are the results of both anthropogenic activity and also natural processes. But think of the damages during a coastal storm, for example. Those are affected by two things. Number one, the frequency and the magnitude of the storm events. And number two, the socioeconomic conditions in the coastal communities and the coastal management decisions. So what are the solutions with respect to these management decisions? We really, obviously, there's no perfect or permanent solutions, and we should really view sea level rise adaptation from the context of sustainable hazard mitigation. So for example, think of a harbor storm surge barrier. It may work for some years up to a certain sea level limit before it needs to be rebuilt, moved, or abandoned. So the way to go, would be to work on resilience and adaptation mechanisms, and that involves action before, during, and after the disaster to make sure that we reduce risks to coastal livelihoods and properties. Did we learn anything new from COVID-19? Basically, it's the same lesson that we fail to learn again and again. It doesn't make sense to only respond to what we are experiencing now. We need to act decisively to move away from the current path to a whole different trajectory altogether, where we actually have the capacity to cope with the problem. And that involves understanding vulnerabilities and building resilience. What is the problem with COVID-19? Obviously, it's the fact that it's exponentially growing due to the explosive nature of the transmission. And it is the hospital capacity really that determines our ability to cope. So, for example, the number of health workers, hospital beds, masks, ventilators, you name it. Now, try and think in this framework about coastal risk management. For example, the exponential growth of greenhouse gas emissions, and there you have another different story, but with a similar pattern. So in this case, the ability to cope depends on the sea level rise, how strong the storms are, the floods, the droughts, the heat waves. So think of COVID-19 as an accelerated version of climate change. The do's and the don'ts. Well, first of all, we can't let the current state of things determine our policies, and we also can't let today's severity determine how we will be perceiving risk. And we've seen, at least in the US, in several cases, governments not shutting down whole states based on conditions at that very moment, which resulted in big failures, obviously. And the same goes for coastal risk. So the severity of today's floods don't tell us much. We really need to look instead at the severity of the future risk events under the current trajectory. Then we also shouldn't delay action or underplay risk, which is something that has happened both in the case of COVID-19 and, of course, as we know, in our perception of climate change and how quickly this is happening or whether it is really happening. And then we also need to learn how to cooperate at an individual and at a collective level, and this may include solidarity, mutual help within and across communities and also across states, even things like open access science. It helps to think about these issues as weakest link public goods. So the supply of COVID-19 eradication can be seen as a weakest link public good because it requires universal cooperation. So what's the main assumption behind weakest link public goods? For most countries, the benefit that the country derives from the public good exceeds the costs of producing the good. So herd immunity, for example, is a weakest link global public good, which can be hindered by one or more countries' failure to vaccinate its population if and once a vaccine would be available. So think of an endemic disease, for example. If the efforts for its eradication fail, then the many years invested in the rest of the world would be of little value. And we've seen that happening with smallpox and polio. So, the supply of climate change abatement has similar characteristics. It can be seen as an aggregated effort, global public good, where reducing the world's greenhouse gas emissions depends on the aggregate effort of all countries, and a single country cannot stabilize atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases all by itself, certainly not by reducing its emissions unilaterally. I also want to go into some equity considerations when we say policies. And these dimensions I just mentioned become even more clear when we think about equity. As both Jason and Nancy mentioned earlier, exposure and vulnerability to hazards disproportionately affect vulnerable community members with lower adaptive capacity. So would you think that employees without paid sick leave would be likely to quarantine? Would citizens without health insurance be likely to get tested? So we really need to act considering that we're all in it together. Some policies may be hitting the poorest the hardest, and so progress on the virus front could come along with losses on the equity front if design of policies doesn't happen carefully. And COVID-19 responses have provided evidence that investments in social infrastructure help build critical adaptive capacity within communities. These benefits increase when we strategically design policies for the most vulnerable to climate change. So as a proactive community strategy, it is important to invest in social resilience to mitigate costs and losses that inequity exacerbates, and also to alleviate the pressure on critical systems in times of crisis. And I want to close by saying that there's a lot of politicization and unrealistic expectations from science, I find. Social scientists usually emphasize a system's ability to cope and adapt to change. And in many cases, although these problems have social dimensions, these are sometimes ignored. But social systems cannot be easily separated from ecological systems, which is why we have the concept of socio-ecological resilience, which attempts to capture this interaction. And I also see politicization of climate change on both sides, with neither being completely honest about the cost of climate change itself, and of responding. But of course, there's positive feedbacks on both sides. Then, on the other hand, we see COVID-19 leverage for political objectives. So on the one side, for example, you see some people using it as an opportunity for institutional shifts, such as, for example, in the healthcare system. And on the other side, others using it as a weapon to combat, say, migration. And I want to close by saying that if we are to think of politics in this process, this needs to be done in terms of intergenerational stewardship and balancing short and long-term investments, instead of merely leveraging ideologies. And yeah, with that, I want to thank you and turn it back to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Melina. A lot of points to compare in the short and long-term perspective is very interesting in terms of what might be done and maybe what is or isn't being done. So our last panelist is Paul Foley, who's an associate professor in the Environmental Policy Institute at Memorial University of Newfoundland's Grenfell campus. He received a PhD in political science from York University in Toronto, specializing in political economy and global governance. His work draws on political economy and political ecology to study relationships between environmental governance and social development, with a current empirical emphasis on oceans, fisheries, seafood, and coastal communities. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Ron, and thanks for the opportunity to join this really interesting panel, and many thanks to the organizers as well. As I prepared for this talk, I spent some time thinking about the panel description, as people have identified earlier. It's compelling. I think it's provocative, and I think I'd like to address it in a way I expect might also be seen as a bit provocative, though I think it's consistent with the urgency, scope, and magnitude of the problem as defined in the description. So what I'd like to call for in this brief talk is the development of a Blue New Deal policy framework for addressing coastal risk and climate governance, and catalyzing in a more systematic way the important kinds of policy examples we've heard from already. So I trust people have heard, at least in general terms, about the concept of the Green New Deal. So the Blue New Deal is extending some of the key principles of a Green New Deal into coastal and ocean contexts. And before I say a few words about what a Blue New Deal might look like, I'd like to briefly address the description of the panel directly, because I think it helps explain why I think a bold, creative, and transformative framework like a Blue New Deal is really necessary for coastal risk governance. So just to quote the description here, if both COVID-19 and climate change are to be treated as emergencies, the response by our leadership should have many of the same characteristics, including a clear, adaptable, and coordinated approach. And this panel will explore viable policy options for the climate during and following the challenges brought about by COVID-19. And of course, the title of the panel asks us what lessons from the pandemic we can apply to coastal risk governance. So if we accept the premise that we're in a climate emergency and that our leadership needs to respond to this crisis with a clear, adaptable, and coordinated approach, what can we learn from the pandemic? So I'd like to identify four major lessons, and I'll discuss the idea of a Blue New Deal policy framework within the context of those four lessons. So the first lesson for me is that the COVID-19 emergency demonstrates how collective public emergencies can change collective notions of what we even consider and understand as viable. So massive public investments to support the economy and workers that would have been unthinkable a year ago are considered necessary and common sense now. Policies that would be widely considered radical a year ago are now considered simply as necessary. And policies, that would be widely considered unviable a year ago are now normal parts of crisis management. So the massive public spending by the Government of Canada at the outset had virtually no major resistance from the opposition parties at the outset of the pandemic. The pandemic emergency therefore expanded the horizons of possibility and viability in terms of public investment and to some degree public behavior. So that's lesson number one for me. What's viable or unviable is changeable as societal conditions change under crisis or emergency situations. A second lesson for me is that both the pandemic emergency and the policy responses to it tend to reveal and even exacerbate large-scale inequities, and we've heard a bit about that already. So the COVID-19 crisis demonstrates how marginalized groups, racialized groups, low-income groups, women, Indigenous communities, and otherwise systematically disadvantaged communities bear a disproportionate risk in public health emergencies. And research shows how climate change impacts are similar. The lesson here for me is that major policy responses to coastal climate governance ought to include a few things. They ought to include members of these marginalized groups in decision-making processes as much as possible. And even substantively, it will demand policies that will ensure more equitable distribution of risks and benefits, including access to clean energy, for example, or affordable clean energy, and funding education and training to better enable those groups to manage risks and to secure benefits from changing coastal and blue economies in the future. Shifting to actual policy responses, a third lesson for me is that the climate emergency, just like the pandemic, is really a multi-layered crisis, or it's multiple crises or emergencies. It's really a set of crises requiring integrated knowledge and coordinated responses. So of course, the pandemic is just not a problem for epidemiologists. It's not even just a public health emergency. It's an emergency that's challenging the very nature and capacity of society, economies, and polities. And indeed, it's a civilizational challenge to some degree. And the climate change emergency is, of course, similarly civilizational. But the key difference, as we heard earlier, is that it's perceived widely as a more slow-moving and long-term emergency. Nevertheless, some people have begun to argue for more integrated, systematic, and progressive public policy and economic emergency measures to the climate emergency. There's been a lot of discussion about the Green New Deal in the US context, but some groups have begun to identify policy options for a Blue New Deal. I'm not aware of efforts to define a Blue New Deal program within Canada, but some of the individuals and organizations using the concept in the US and UK have published some material to allow us to identify and imagine potential seeds of a creative, bold, and transformative policy framework. So what might this look like? What might a Blue New Deal policy framework look like? It could have a series of policies or sets of policies. One set of policies could focus on coastal adaptation and living shorelines. We've heard good examples already. It could also include programs for helping vulnerable and low-income communities retreat from unstable shorelines, including buyout programs for high-risk residential properties, catalyzing the development of living shoreline industries, potentially creating thousands of jobs that rehabilitate coastal ecosystems and fund natural infrastructure development that we've also heard about. Another set of policies could focus on clean coastal and ocean energy, catalyzing research and development into small scale and perhaps even large scale coastal and offshore wind power, controversial but worth exploring, and creating robust programs that actually assess through research and meaningful public engagement renewable energy systems that are not yet quite proven around wave, current, tidal, and thermal. Another set of policies could or probably must focus on accelerating the decarbonization of marine industries, so port industries, shipping industries, fishing industries. We're very early in that process and behind in many ways. Another set of policies could focus on life itself below water, so including biodiversity and sustainable seafood, so looking at restoration of fish and sea life habitat, working with coastal policymakers and communities to develop more innovative marine protected areas that are sensitive to ecological conservation and social justice concerns, and developing policies that will better help us better understand and respond to fundamental changes in the distribution, location, and abundance of fish caused by climate change, which really puts fishing community economies and food security at risk. So the Blue New Deal at a general level is about reducing carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions while catalyzing whole economy transformations with overall principles of environmental protection and social justice, including a focus on the provision of safe, well-paying jobs for workers across the growing blue economy. The current devastating dislocation of some offshore oil workers in Newfoundland provides an example into the importance of policies that support and incentivize transitions, both for individual workers and for the educational and training institutions, so that these workers and others have the skills and training required to build and maintain renewable energy and related infrastructure in the decades ahead. So a fourth and final lesson of the pandemic for me is that governments have proven, yes, with very mixed and uneven results, but they have proven that they have the capacity to provide, coordinated responses to the pandemic, responses that are also sensitive to national and local contexts. While we're entering the winter when cracks in even the best government responses to the pandemic will reveal themselves with further terrible consequences. At the other end of the spectrum, we see in the United States what can happen with an almost complete lack of leadership and without a coordinated multi-governance response. So in terms of next steps in developing an actual coordinated response to the climate emergency, Blue New Deal policy options would have to be obviously further articulated, but also translated into complementary legislation and policy frameworks by national, subnational, and municipal authorities, right? So the frameworks would need to be complementary and also sensitive to the flexibility required for regionally and locally defined and driven responses and adaptation. A coordinated response would also require a great deal of work to build legitimacy and credibility, probably through coalition building of civil society, scientists, labor unions, key actors in the private sector, Indigenous peoples and youth. Building such a coalition would obviously wouldn't be easy. There's strong and powerful resistance to these kind of approaches, but it might be possible. And I suppose if we're serious about this, it must be possible. We need to make it possible. And to end here, since 40% of the world's population live within 100 kilometers of the coast, there's a strong case to be made that the climate emergency is fundamentally a coastal governance emergency already. So coastal risk governance should not be on the margins of policy responses to the climate crisis. They ought to be at the center of the discussion. And if it is, I hope something truly bold, creative, and transformative, like a Blue New Deal, guides the way forward. Thank you, and back to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Paul. A lot of food for thought there. Thanks to all the panelists for excellent presentations. We're now going to start the question and answer portion of the event. To the audience, please type into the Q&A box if you have a question, and preferably address it to one of the speakers, although more than one may volunteer to add their thoughts. So put the target's name in there so they can think about the answer. Thank you. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the remaining time, but we may not get to all of them. To start off, I'm going to ask Nancy a question. Jason commented on the fact that some of the more vulnerable communities are the small ones, small coastal communities, and therefore higher levels of government, provincial, federal, might be a necessary ingredient, let's say, to move that forward. Now, I know a little bit about in Nova Scotia the gas tax, which was a source of funding to help move some of those programs forward. Do you think that was a good example of money being collected at a different level and being targeted, or is it not effective? Or can you think of what you know of next steps for those communities longer term? How would that go?
That's a great question. From the contact that I've had from various municipalities that are struggling with coastal climate change issues, while they may have done some terrific work, and of course the coastal climate change aspects came out in their MCAPs, their municipal climate change action plans. As happens with a lot of things, when something is funded but there's nothing behind it for resources, sometimes you'll motivate and engage a community and get them involved, and they'll retain expertise and so on and come up with a viable adaptation plan. But without the resources to then move to action, and it sort of falls flat and gets shelved, and governments change and so on. So I've seen a number of examples of that. I've looked at some of those action plans and they're terrific, but I have municipalities calling me and saying, we have a really serious problem here and we're not sure what to do. And we heard, I've had one municipality call me because somehow they mustered up their own resources to retain a coastal engineering firm and get an excellent report that gave them a whole plethora of viable adaptation options. And this was post their climate adaptation plan. But even now they have some options and they're making some decisions and so on, but they're still not in a position to harness the resources. And so, I mean, we see disaster mitigation funds come out on a federal level, and I've talked to provincial government representatives and lots of municipal governments. We don't have a coordinating body to help get those proposals in place. And what we end up with, as Jason mentioned, is those rural coastal communities are even more inclined these days to issue permits for inappropriate coastal developments because they're so eager for the municipal revenue while they are dealing with their priority flooding town square. And that's happening all around our coast. So it was a great initiative. It was great to harness revenues, but now maybe Nova Scotia needs to harness some of the cap and trade funds and actually mobilize to action. Let's do a baseline coastal adaptation options report for the entire province, acknowledging our diverse coastline, but that moves the needle on the awareness and understanding of adaptation options, because there are a lot of them available and some of them fit really well together. Some have really great, there's lots of pros and cons to different options. So we need to move farther along for those municipal decision makers to move closer to action.
Great, thank you. And maybe before taking, we have a few questions from the audience here. I'll just extend that a bit, maybe to Jason, or but maybe one of the other people want to comment as well. To tie it back to COVID, do you know if in the short or even medium term there's going to be a huge draw on resources, as we can imagine, to deal with COVID, to the point where any most climate change programs, support, funding, attention, I mean, there's this idea of trying to line some of those initiatives as we're in this post-COVID world, right? Try to get both moving. Or is it just going to shift attention significantly away from those kind of programs for a while because of the COVID imperatives?
I'm happy to have others speak. I know Melina and Paul both touched on that.
All right, Melina, would you like to comment next?
Well, the one thing is that I feel that there's a lot of people out there who feel frustrated that COVID-19 recovery plan has been part of an emergency management, while climate change mitigation actions have been considered business as usual. So I want to hope that there's not going to be such a scenario where financial resources will be directed from climate change budgets into COVID-19 budgets. So I want to think that policies and actions for these two issues are going to continue and supplement each other, really. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'll take a question from the audience here, I believe for Jason. Who is liable in the case of known hazards like coastal development that is permitted under both provincial and municipal regulations, but indeed is a substantial risk should the risk occur?
Right, that's a very good question. So for that liability to actually exist, that hazard has to be foreseeable, and it has to be clear that the municipality took no actions of any kind, or the province then took actions of any kind to try and deal with that hazard. And so we've seen lawsuits in some municipalities. I don't know, I'm not aware of any on terms of coastal risk, but there's a lot when it comes to stormwater infrastructure, and so municipalities can be held liable there. for failing to upkeep stormwater infrastructure that leads to flooding. I'll open up to the other panelists to speak, but the burden is very high on trying to prove, the threshold for proving liability is very high and difficult to do in Canada for the municipality. There's a lot of protection around for municipalities and provinces in making those types of decisions. And ultimately, they have processes that they are going to say that they have gone through to demonstrate that they account for that risk, whether it's engineering assessments of the risk or the permitting process, and that usually legally carries enough weight. Now, I can say we asked Canadians this question twice now in surveys of 2,500 people living in high-risk areas, and they absolutely want municipalities and provinces to be liable for this. I mean, I actually think that what needs to happen here before we get anything is actually a discussion around liability, right? I mean, you talk about funding managed retreat or property relocation. A discussion has to happen there. Well, who ultimately is liable for making the poor development decision? And if you take I suppose a perspective where we look at the benefits of that development and whom it has benefited, I mean, really it's benefited taxpayers across that particular community. So it's difficult to sort of really confer that specific liability legally in Canada, but also equitably in that many times people are building, even municipalities are building in areas that they are unsure about the risk, and they're relying on consultants and developers, really pushing them. So, I'm very empathetic towards local governments and the situation that they're in when it comes to this. So, that's why I'm supportive of things like managed retreat and property relocation funded by the federal government, which is ultimately the insurer of last resort in the country. So maybe I'll turn it over to Nancy or someone else if they've got a specific example of liability in the coastal community.
Thank you, Jason. I'll wait a few seconds here and see if one of the other panelists wants to add to that.
I might just, I'd love to jump in just for a second. I kind of speculate right now. I think we're at a tipping point when it comes to coastal risk and liability. We're already seeing, I think we've crossed that threshold with things like floodplain mapping. And, there was a period of time where no one wanted to see the floodplain map because if they owned a property in there, their value would go through the basement and they wouldn't be able to sell, or if they owned property, they wouldn't be able to build and so on. And yet the municipality is bound that they have to release this and they need to protect their citizens. And there's been some tricky stuff happening there, particularly Southern Ontario and places. Nova Scotia, it's been interesting. People will often say to me when I do a presentation, well, surely insurance is taking care of this, but coastal flooding is not. It wasn't covered by any insurance instrument until May of 2018, and only one insurer has ventured, to my surprise, to that venue. So even if you build a house and then you are not deemed eligible for insurance, then that's not happening with coastal flood risk. You're not really able to go back right now and sue the municipality. And in Halifax, we have this odd little example called undersized lots. And even though Halifax has a setback and a vertical allowance, if your property is along the coast and it's deemed an undersized lot, it's exempt from all of those. So you're buying that lot, you're actually not being afforded the same protection that everyone else is. And I find that alarming. I have all kinds of horrifying pictures of homes being built and just not far from my home that have no protection. One of them has the foundation like a foot from the ocean and at ocean level on a normal day. So at some point very soon, I believe we are going to see lawsuits happening. And there's that tension between buyer beware. Well, you bought it and built it, you should have known better. But I have to assume that at some point people are going to be able to say, well, why didn't my lot have that same setback? Why did you let me do this? And it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, very good points. Sort of reality check some ongoing issues right now. I have a question from the audience for Paul. You touched on this briefly, but what do you think the major barriers to the Blue New Deal are? Which businesses, industries do you see as being most opposed to these policy changes?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, there's tons of obstacles, obviously, to a major, government-led initiative, even if it's not, fully well defined yet. I would say one of the obstacles are, what we would call structural, right? So the fiscal situation of governments, especially coming out of COVID, we're probably going to be dealing with this for a decade of being fiscally in a tough situation. Many governments all over the world. And so in that context, the fiscal barriers are going to be substantial in terms of public investments in major initiatives like a Blue New Deal. And global financial norms around this are part of that problem. If bond rate or rating agencies make it difficult for governments to get further in debt. Otherwise, they're downgraded, and so there are negative implications. So there's a large set of structural obstacles in that way that difficult to change, but important. And then there's sort of your industries, obviously the oil and gas industry, and those who stand to potentially lose from higher regulations, or the idea of a post-carbon transition in a sooner rather than later. There would be significant resistance. But I just note too that Mark Carney, that he's been widely cited around this, but Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, has recently said that the zero carbon goal could be the greatest commercial opportunity of our time, right? So you see some of the mainstream economic leaders thinking through this as also an opportunity, right? So you're going to see major economic players shifting and trying to find a way to capitalize on that. Jason Kenney, I think in a news report a few days ago from the government of Alberta, sort of acknowledged that any future moves to develop the oil industry out there will require a consideration of the climate, right? So that's a major shift in his discourse and that political spectrum. Major obstacles, but there are windows of opportunity I think we would want to exploit.
Great, thank you very much. Another question I believe is being posed to Jason. Do property rights create an obstacle to the implementation of precautionary policy? And if yes, how will government overcome that obstacle?
Right, less so in Canada. Governments have eminent domain. They can acquire private property for public purposes, roads, electricity corridors, whatever it may be. It's more complicated in the United States, where some form of compensation is required. And in Canada, we do compensate when we do acquire private property, and we should adequately compensate for private property. So an example that I always like to think about is something like property buyouts, manage retreat. Some governments we should be adequately compensating people for the value of the property at the market price before a flood or something dangerous, as opposed to after, for reasons of equity, and that it's the right thing to do, but it also ensures the success of these programs. People are interested in transferring property, so it's not as much of an issue in Canada as it is in other countries. Governments have the power to be able to do that if they want to.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. We're welcoming more questions from the audience, and in the meantime, I have another question for Melina. It's fairly open-ended, but I'm not really sure what you've thought about this. But again, comparing COVID and climate change and short-term and long-term and all that, one of the things you commented on is sort of not having the current state of affairs drive the decisions too much. And as a risk analyst myself, as all the people on the panel think about risks, you don't want to just be reactive, and you don't want to ingrain things. You want to think about the future. What are the most likely conditions we have to deal with and the best way to do it. So my question is, that doesn't seem to happen easily with climate change. It does I guess, on the big scale with, the Accords and Rio and the Paris Accord and things kind of generally moving. But down at the grassroots people level, there's a lot of resistance sometimes, and other times, maybe ignorance or disinterest. But you could also think about the same phenomenon at COVID, even though the scale's different and it's all pretty new. So I guess, is there any comparable lessons from one side or the other to move that kind of thinking forward and get people to be a little more generous towards future generations and protect the general public and not be thinking too small or too selfishly? Are there parallels between those two worlds?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Ron. I think there's definitely parallels in how we're thinking about this. As I was talking earlier regarding being able to think about, when designing policies, being able to think about how these policies or plans and actions will affect not only our generation, but also future generations. So in a way, we really need to take responsibility for that and plan for a future that we want the future generation to experience, or make sure that they avoid these shocks that our generation has experienced. And as I said in my talk, in both the cases of like climate change and COVID-19, the general risk management principles apply. But the question is, we know these lessons, but are they lessons learned, or have we failed to listen to these lessons? And then on top of that, the climate risks, such as, for example, floods, droughts, or whatever, they're being layered on top of the public health and really the economic crisis, and the risks that are fueled by the pandemic, and each one of them is exacerbating each other, I feel like. So I think that the pandemic in some ways has uncovered some strengths in our community that have to do with preparedness and the capacity to adapt and the ability to identify with more accuracy the vulnerabilities, for instance, how disadvantaged groups and marginalized groups are disproportionately affected, such as elderly, indigenous peoples, and women, chronically ill, and so on and so forth. So bolstering these strengths and addressing these vulnerabilities can help us secure ourselves from these risks, either from the pandemic or from climate change. And if we really want to learn these lessons and apply them to the design of policies, so as to also secure the future generation from experiencing these things and building current community resilience, both in the short term and in the long term, as you mentioned.
Thank you. And before moving on, there's another question I'll ask if any other panelists want to add to that comment.
Yeah, I would just say that, I mean, you've seen, and this speaks to, I think, what Paul was speaking about as well, you've seen governments respond in ways that you would never have anticipated, where they've just quickly done things that you know, the best example I have here in Ontario is we threw out more or less 120 years of prohibition laws in a matter of days when the pandemic started. And, you know, these laws were the subject of decades of aggressive lobbying, and it just took the premier with a magic wand saying, whoop, gone, right? We managed to convince almost every Canadian to normalize mask wearing as a behavior, you know, in a culture that is admittedly very against sort of the intrusion into my sort of personal behavior. So I really think it's shown that when we feel as though the community is at risk and that are issued the license to operate for governments and for us as a community to respond is huge, and we just have to find ways of taking advantage of it.
Thank you. Any other comments on that point? So another question came in for you, Jason, elaborating on the precautionary issue. It says, you referred to precautionary approaches. Notwithstanding our climate concerns, precautionary approaches can be expensive and can work against an entrepreneurial spirit. Are you concerned that public bureaucracies armed with a precautionary approach will become even slower, more risk-averse, less innovative? Post-COVID-19, won't there be a need for some urgent policy innovation?
Well, I think an important part of the precautionary principle is acting fast. And so we're slow now. I mean, one of the reasons why we don't have things like rapid testing, or even, so my favorite example of this is Health Canada at first refused to approve drive-through testing because it was concerned that, you know, that public health workers were being put at risk. There was too much risk. Yet we saw that these were quite successful in places like South Korea and Germany. So we have this tendency in Canada where there's some, I feel, almost bureaucratic ego that we kind of have to make up our own data. We have to make up our own rules and reinvent the wheel a little bit when we don't necessarily need to do that. Where I think that bureaucracy, and I think that another part of the precautionary principle is that government bureaucracies also need to experiment and recognize that there's going to be failures and that there are going to be things that don't work. We need layers and layers of redundancy and ways of ideas that some aren't going to work and some are going to work, right? And it's not just within the government that needs to do this, though. Government doesn't just have all the capacity here. It needs to employ a range of and diversity of non-governmental stakeholders, private sector, you name it. You know, you have. It is such a complex problem that we're working on. That, and this is my frustration oftentimes with the pandemic, just throw everything you got at it. You know, throw everything you got at it right now. I mean, money's cheap. People are buying Canadian bonds. People are buying 30-year Canadian bonds. You know, so I'm not, the whole economic constraint around this to me seems a little puzzling. And it's what we hear a lot from governments. Oh, we want to show that we're going to have a balanced budget here or there. And it drives me crazy. This is a once in 100-year event. So I think the precautionary principle could, yes, lead to some troubles with bureaucracies having, you know, guidelines and rules in place and things like that. But, you know, fundamentally, that bureaucracy didn't matter much when the pandemic hit and we were just changing rules, you know, willy-nilly when it came to all different parts of the economy and putting them down lockdowns and whatnot, right? So the potential's there. But that's a good question.
Yeah, so the precautionary principle sounds like is often used appropriately or inappropriately to slow things down or lock things up, but can be also viewed as just a perspective on the world, whether you move fast or not to deal with an issue. It's just taking the right perspective sometimes to avoid those potential disasters. Here's a question for Melina. You referred to determining a community's willingness to pay. Are there reliable ways or methods to determine community willing to pay in the context of coastal risk?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. Well, yes, indeed, I talked about the importance of having the communities themselves choose the losses that they're willing to accept. And in the environmental and resource economics literature, there's different methods of doing that, like and trying to capture both tangible and intangible values, like contingent valuation method and even choice experiments. There's a large literature there, but I believe with limited application to coastal risk and this issue in particular. So I think it warrants further research, but I think it's important to try and capture exactly this willingness to say preserve or retreat, try to capture the perceptions of community members on the actual risk they face. Yeah, despite the existence of methodologies that can help you do this, the values are likely to differ. So then even if you get a response from the community themselves, it doesn't mean that paves an easy path to design policies. Yeah, I don't know if that covers your question.
Yeah, and Jason, did you want to add to that in the sense of not really your work trying to evaluate levels of damage? Does that help show or convince people, not just the government, about the value of what they're protecting and how much, other than their own house, and how much people would need to pool resources to protect things for a community, or has that not come up at that level?
I think there's trade-offs there. So I know that there's a lot of work in Canada around trying to price the cost of inaction. Within sort of that community, that senior people I know within that community are sort of saying, well, how many reports have come out with just a big number, and people just kind of go, oh, you know, they ignore it, right? So I think it's a combination of not just sort of the economics, but getting to people, other behavioral aspects that people, you know, the value that people put into a place, you know, so we know that convincing arguments, for instance, for trying to get a municipality to change their planning is that, you know, well, you may lose this walking trail that a number of people in the community, you know, walk their dog on, and that's sufficient for them to go down to council and raise a little hell to avoid, you know, a development that could lead to an increased risk of flooding, as opposed to just, you know, a couple wet basements here or there. But certainly with senior decision makers in government, they tend to like that stuff. They tend to like coming in with some of the bottom lines around the costs and benefits. And but I'm not convinced about that case sort of for a broader cultural, you know, or even local change.
Sure, thank you. Anybody want to add to that, Nancy or Paul?
I'll sneak in there for a second, Paul, if that's okay. My office has done a very simplistic version of a community coastal adaptation toolkit, and it's you know, it's to be distributed to communities so that they can have some of those difficult discussions. It's not as much about the budget or the cost side, but I suspect you could add a participatory budgeting component to it. But it's about assessing risk in the community center and kind of prioritizing which of these community assets are we most motivated to try to preserve, and what are we going to do, and you get folks to buy in and engage and make those decisions themselves. So it seems to me it wouldn't be a stretch to be able to then do some participatory budgeting, or to translate that into, okay, well, who are we going to align ourselves with in order to try to secure the financial resources we need and the expertise we need, and so on. So and then you've got the whole community on board, understanding it. Then, you know, you can even engage your community for some sweat equity when it comes to some of the things that can be done along the shore. So I think it's a good idea to involve a community in there. And then when it, you know, I often get sort of fearful government people saying, you don't think when you're going on about this needed coastal climate change adaptation plan that government needs to pay for that, do you? And I really don't. Obviously, it's expensive stuff and there needs to be some contribution, but I think there's a role to play at every level. And so I don't think it's a matter of, particularly when it comes to private property, I'm not saying that the government should be bailing out. You know, there are different cases. You're buying a property now that's risky now. I think you should be a lot more on the hook for the repairs. If you're in a property that has lost, you know, in Dorian, someone called me out to the property, they'd lost 25 feet of land in some spots, and that property had been their family for more than 50 years. That's a little different, but I still don't think it's the government's responsibility to pay for it. Ideally, there might be some mitigation, compensation, and so on, but I think there's a lot of levels involved there. So.
Great, thank you. There's a question from the audience here for Paul/Jason, so I'm going to ask both of you to try to contribute to this. You have noted social inequities that have come to the fore as a result of COVID-19. Coastal risks in Western societies, however, can affect people of means, people with money. Flood insurance program in the US is frequently cited as a subsidy for the well-off. Aren't there some significant limitations to this comparison, and how should these differences play out in policy discussions? Either of you want to start?
Yeah, I can start.
Sure,
I can't say much. I'll let Jason jump in and explain certainly the nuances of the insurance industry, and it's a really important example. But I think the example here is actually a good example of an inequity. If wealthy people can protect themselves and benefit from insurance programs, that's obviously an inequity. It's not, inequities are not just about looking at people who have less means or who are disadvantaged. It's also about revealing and challenging the fact that those who have more ability, power, and ability are often unequally taking advantage of. They have the greater ability to protect themselves and adapt to these situations in one way or another, right? So I think researchers have a really important role to play here in terms of identifying inequities and the different effects and consequences of various programs and policies, whether it's insurance programs, because as I think Nancy alluded to this earlier, that it's one thing to create policies, but we need to have a clear understanding of their effects, because many policies have unintended consequences and effects. So we need to be really careful about assuming that a policy will have a simple solution. We need to be rigorous in terms of following and tracking potential different scenarios and outcomes. And I know I'd say that's really important. And Melina mentioned the intergenerational, issue, and that's really important in terms of equity as well. That the people who are most likely to be hurt by climate change are those who have least contributed to massive emissions and so forth. So there's in terms of the inequities with the global south and developing countries. So yeah, I think we need to be cautious, but I think universities could be a big player in that regard.
Yeah, I echo all of Paul's sentiments there, and the insurance example is a great one. In Florida, insurance companies tried to adjust their models to incorporate climate change. And what that, of course, led to was a significant increase in the cost of insurance for coastlines, people living along coastlines. Now, you may think, okay, this is kind of an unjust thing that's going to be happening to a lot of people who don't deserve to have their insurance rates increase. But what actually ended up happening was a lot of rich people ran to the governor and said, how dare you increase our insurance on our lovely oceanside homes. And the state intervened and said to insurance companies, you cannot go ahead with updating those models for climate change. So as Paul mentioned, you have to design flood insurance in a way that balances that trade-off, and that you are not just offering subsidies to those who can afford it. And in fact, Canada is undergoing a process right now where we are designing a flood insurance program supported at the federal level to help those people living in a high-risk community. And I think that the way we go about designing, we have an opportunity here in Canada to make sure that the way we go about designing that flood insurance model is with a heavy emphasis on socioeconomic vulnerability. We tend in risk management or in insurance to overemphasize the hazard and particularly the exposure side of it, right? So we want to have insurance available where there are very expensive assets mixing with a hazard, which generally means, cities and places with a lot of resources, less so rural communities that actually can get really knocked out for quite a while from these types of adverse events. So we really what we want to do here is, and we're doing some analysis right now on this, is well, how do we define affordability for things like insurance in Canada? What parameters should we be using to define what is a high risk area where insurance is going to be expensive and unaffordable, and what role should government have in making sure that it is affordable in those high risk areas? And so we kind of have an opportunity here to learn from some of the challenges and barriers and issues around social inequity that we've seen in the US models and a couple other models, and really try and do something different, which I think we're excited about and is a big opportunity. So great question.
Thank you both. So our time's just about up for today. So I'd like to thank all our panelists very much, all our speakers for all their remarks, covering a wide variety of topics and answering the questions. And of course, I'd like to thank the MacEachen Institute and MEOPAR NC for hosting this event, and say thanks to everyone who joined us for this evening's event, and good night to all.